Joe Biden has been a lifelong supporter of Israel. He met with legendary Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir 50 years ago in his very first year as a senator. This week, on Wednesday, he went to Israel to hug Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to offer his and America's unyielding support to a Jewish state still reeling from a violent Hamas attack that killed more than 1,400 Israelis. And then on Thursday evening, back in the Oval Office, the president addressed the American public on the subject of U.S. support for Israel and for Israel's latest war in Gaza.
In Israel, we must make sure that they have what they need to protect their people today and always. The security package I'm sending to Congress and asking Congress to do is an unprecedented commitment to Israel's security that will sharpen Israel's qualitative military edge, which we've committed to, the qualitative military edge.
For me, though, the line that stood out on Thursday came not from Joe Biden's Oval Office speech. It came from one of Israel's top officials, a senior member of Netanyahu's security cabinet, speaking to reporters. Hostages and civilian casualties will be secondary to destroying Hamas, Economy Minister Nir Barakat told ABC News, even if it takes a year. Hold on. Saving the hostages is secondary to destroying Hamas? Shouldn't that be the main mission? There are still around 200 people being held by Hamas, according to the Israeli military, despite the freeing of 2 American hostages on Friday. And avoiding civilian casualties is also secondary to destroying Hamas? Isn't making sure civilians don't get unnecessarily killed in conflict a key part of international humanitarian law? So tonight, with an Israeli ground invasion of Gaza still looming, is this the kind of war, a year-long war perhaps, according to Israel's own top minister, that the Biden administration has really signed up for? Is this what the American public has signed up for? Listen to what other Israeli officials have been saying too, out loud, unashamedly. Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, reacted to Hamas's surprise attack on Israeli soldiers and civilians in the south of the country on October the 7th by ordering a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. No electricity, no food, no fuel. He added, "We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly." Israel Katz, the energy minister, said no electrical switch will be turned on in Gaza, no water pump will be opened, and no fuel truck will enter until the Israeli abductees are returned home. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, tweeted, "As long as Hamas does not release the hostages in its hands, the only thing that needs to enter Gaza are hundreds of tons of explosives from the Air Force, not an ounce of humanitarian aid." Israeli military spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said about Israel's bombing of Gaza, quote, "The emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy." Is the Biden administration okay with all of this? And is the US public on board with unconditionally backing this kind of war and bombing and siege of civilians? I mean, even the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, a moderate, quote unquote, suggested this week that the innocent civilian population of Gaza, 2.3 million people, half of them children, wasn't so innocent. They could have risen up, he said. They could have fought against Hamas. That's the kind of dangerous rhetoric that leads to collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. That's the kind of rhetoric that leads to thousands of Palestinians, including kids, killed in Gaza over the past 2 weeks. Tens of thousands displaced from their homes, which have been turned to rubble. Right now in Gaza, the humanitarian situation is so dire that, as the Associated Press reports this weekend, surgeons in Gaza City's overcrowded hospitals are having to use vinegar instead of antiseptic, sewing needles instead of surgical ones. They're having to wrap burn victims in clothes because they run out of bandages. Now, the Biden administration would, of course, argue that it is working to ensure Israel abides by the laws of war and has also made efforts to get humanitarian aid into Gaza, from announcing $100 million in U.S. aid for the occupied West Bank and Gaza to pushing for an opening of Egypt's Rafah crossing with Gaza and getting 20 trucks of aid through on Saturday and 14 trucks today. But come on, 34 trucks of aid in total for over 2 million hungry, ill, wounded, displaced people? Oh, and while it didn't get that much coverage in the US media this week, on Wednesday, while Biden was in Israel, the UN Security Council voted on a resolution to condemn violence against all civilians, Israeli and Palestinian, while calling for humanitarian pauses to the fighting in order to get enough aid into Gaza. The only country to vote against it, to veto it? Yes, the United States. The Biden administration, saying it was too early for such a resolution. This despite the fact that, according to a poll from the progressive group Data for Progress, 66% of likely voters, including 56% of Republican voters, say they want the Biden administration to call for a ceasefire in Gaza and a de-escalation of the violence. And a Wall Street Journal Ipsos poll out today finds a majority of Americans think the US has a responsibility to support Israel, but also to push for negotiations to end the conflict. So the choice for Joe Biden is between an American public that, yes, supports Israel, but also wants an end, not an escalation to the fighting, and an Israeli government under Benjamin Netanyahu, which, as I just outlined, wants to destroy Hamas at all costs, even if the hostages are lost in the process, and even as Palestinian civilians continue to be killed in big numbers. In fact, the Israeli government is expanding its air campaign to the occupied West Bank, which isn't run by Hamas. Earlier today, the Israelis bombed a mosque in Jenin, which they claimed was controlled by Hamas militants. The Palestinian Authority said 2 people died. Look, Joe Biden seems to have made his choice. He's backing Israel and Netanyahu. But it's a choice that a president who came to office promising an end to endless wars may come to regret as innocent bodies on both sides continue to pile up.